Silence, please. All stand. This Coroner's Court is now sitting.
Good morning. Mr Castleton.
Your Honour, I appear with my learned friend Mr Harker in relation to three matters this morning in the matter of Mile Creek Road Fire, Bora Ridge, Gosper Mountain Fire, Wallamai National Park and Hillville Fire, Hillville, where Your Honour will receive oral addresses in relation to each of those three. Mr Harker will commence shortly, Your Honour, in relation to the Mile Creek Road Fire, Bora Ridge.
Thank you. Yes, Mr Harker.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mark.
The Mile Creek Road, Bora Ridge Fire, referred to throughout the inquiry as the Mile Creek Road Fire, burnt in the Richmond Valley local government area, encompassed within the lands of the Gallibol and the Bundjalung people. It burned for over 6 weeks and damaged a total area of around 120,000 hectares, destroying or damaging at least 13 homes and causing at least 14 injuries to persons on the fire ground. During the inquiry, the court heard how the fire smouldered underground and in peat, being partially decomposed organic plant matter for a number of weeks, making it difficult to both detect and extinguish. The fire spread rapidly, impacting a number of areas, including Mile Creek, Bora Ridge, Bungarwabin, Gibberajee, Whipperee, Camira, Marsh, New Italy, Myrtle Creek, Wardell, Karaki, West Karaki and Swan Bay. The ferocity of the fire, Your Honour, was captured in this photo by a local resident, Diane Webb. The fire was one of very many fires across the state of New South Wales in the 2019-2020 bushfire season. As Your Honour has heard throughout the last week, not all fires were reported to the coroner. Not all fires reported to the coroner proceeded to a coronial inquiry into cause and origin. Not all fires that proceeded to a coronial inquiry into cause and origin will continue to further consideration via a general inquiry as part of Stage 2 of Your Honour's proceedings. It is submitted that it is not necessary for the Mile Creek Road fire to proceed to further investigation via a general inquiry. Turning now, Your Honour, to the chronology of events. On the morning of 17th of October 2019, Mr Marco Bernardo, who lives at 880 Mile Creek Road, Bora Ridge, saw smoke coming from a neighbouring property at 780 Mile Creek Road. Mr Bernardo told the court that he noticed a small amount of smoke in the low-lying area containing tussocks, about 400 to 500 metres from where he was standing on his property. He took 2 photographs of the smoke because at the time he was concerned about the situation in terms of the dryness and other fires occurring in the area. Displayed now for Your Honour will be 2 photos which were taken by Mr Bernardo. The first one, if we could please just zoom in on the smoke. The second photo, which is a slightly more of a closer up photo, Your Honour, shows the same smoke. It is Mr Bernardo's recollection that the fire that commenced on 17th of October 2019 impacted upon his property and the adjoining property to the north of 780 Mile Creek Road, but was managed over the next day or so. He recalls small amounts of smouldering vegetation and fire on his property on 18 and 19 October 2019. He gave oral evidence that the fire calmed after 20 October 2019. On the 8th of November 2019, Mr Bernardo witnessed fire burning on the same neighbouring property at 780 Mile Creek Road. Mr Bernardo provided evidence that there was smouldering ground on the property, on the adjoining property, along with his property, in the 2 weeks prior to the ignition on 8th of November 2019. He says that the degree of smoke during that period was small and he was of the view that the local fire brigade was monitoring the situation. On the 8th of November 2019, local rural fire service crews were committed to other fires in nearby Karaki and Busby's Flat. Firefighting resources were procured from Fire and Rescue New South Wales, with other local RFS crews arriving shortly after. Unfortunately, by about 4 p.m. that day, a number of properties were destroyed on Bloodwood Drive and Mile Creek Road. The evidence shows how on the following day, being 9th of November 2019, the fire spread in a northerly direction and over containment lines. The fire increased in intensity over the following days. By the 12th of November 2019, the fire had spread significantly, and by the evening, the fire was spotting towards the Pacific Highway. And that is shown, Your Honour, on the fire progression map, which will now be displayed at page 129 of the brief. The Mile Creek Road fire is shown in brown, and the area of the spotting towards the Pacific Highway is just to the east of New Italy. On around 17th of November 2019, the Mile Creek Road fire merged with the Busby's Flat fire. And it is evident, Your Honour, in this fire progression map for that day. Page 134 of the brief. The fire continued to spot and caused significant damage over the next month. On 22 December 2019, the fire was declared out due to favourable weather conditions and extensive containment. Turning now to the investigation of the fire, Your Honour. In November 2019, Mr. Mark Mulheron, an authorised fire investigator with the RFS, attended the fire scene and undertook 3 site investigations of the assumed area of origin. Mr. Mulheron explained in his evidence that the reason for the 3 separate site investigations was due to the 13 hours of work required to track the fire. He was also tasked to undertake other work during that period, which took him away from this particular fire investigation. Mr. Mulheron has provided a report and oral evidence to the court that the area of origin of the Mile Creek Road fire was a slightly wooded area surrounded by open paddocks and a tea tree plantation. He identified a peat bed to the rear of the fire ground. He told the court that he was able to ascertain the specific area of origin of the Mile Creek Road fire and found evidence of a reignition of the fire from the peat bed. Mr. Mulheron confirmed that he was aware of a fire that had originated on 17 October 2019 on the same parcel of land prior to the Mile Creek Road fire. That fire was investigated by Peter Arthur, a different RFS fire investigator, as a part of a separate cause and origin fire investigation. It is his understanding, based on his discussion with Mr. Arthur, that the initial fire, which originated on the 17th of October 2019, was likely caused by a lightning strike. RFS documents contained within the brief of evidence confirm that the fire that commenced on the 17th of October 2019 was named by the RFS as the Bennods Road fire. It is Mr. Mulheron's expert opinion that the fire emerged on 8th of November 2019 due to prevailing weather conditions that exacerbated an already smouldering ground fire, and it emerged from the peat bed. In respect of the cause of the fire, Mr. Mulheron clarified that throughout his report, where he referred to the term debris burning, that he was referring to the smouldering peat. Mr. Mulheron gave evidence that he was able to exclude and eliminate other potential causes of ignition, including lightning and human involvement. The court has received into evidence a volume of documents, which include statements from the New South Wales Police, as well as civilian witnesses, fire investigation reports prepared by the RFS, RFS lightning strike data mapping and investigative documents, and weather data from the Bureau of Meteorology covering the Bora Ridge area. Pursuant to Section 81 of the Coroners Act 2009, the coroner holding an inquiry concerning a fire is required to make findings as to the date and place of the fire and the circumstances of the fire. In addition, the coroner may make recommendations considered necessary or desirable in relation to any matter connected with the fire inquiry. In this inquiry, the focus was on identifying where and when the Mile Creek Road fire originated and the circumstances of the same, including the cause. Turning to expert evidence and key conclusions from that evidence, Your Honour. Mr. Richard Woods, an adjunct lecturer in wildlife investigation and a former inspector and superintendent of the ACT and New South Wales RFS, was engaged to review documents, including statements, RFS investigation reports, lightning strike data, and weather observations relating to the Mile Creek Road fire. Mr. Woods agreed with the conclusions reached by RFS fire investigator Mr. Mulherron, and that the Mile Creek Road fire escaped the peat area at 780 Mile Creek Road and occurred secondary to the fire which originated on the 17th of October 2019. Mr. Woods provided evidence that peat fires are extremely complex and difficult to map. He described peat fires as problematic, particularly in their management, because they do not emit smoke, heat and flame in many instances. The peat consists of semi-broken down or degrading vegetation, which tends to be in a waterlogged or water-evident area. It can be thick and meters deep, and once the fire enters the peat-dead layers, it can burn at a very slow rate for a prolonged period of time. He elaborated that the fire could burn undetected underground for many days, weeks, and months, until such conditions allow it to emerge from the peat itself. Mr. Woods was of the expert opinion that the Mile Creek Road fire was not caused by a single isolated event. Rather, that the lightning strike in a vacant paddock on 17 October 2019, in the vicinity of where Mr. Bernardo saw smoke, caused the fire to progress into a peat bed. Mr. Woods' expert evidence touched on his review of lightning strike data, which supported that there was a number of recorded lightning strikes in the near vicinity of that fire on the 17th of October 2019. Displayed now, for Your Honour, will be a map which is annotated by Mr. Woods, which shows the lightning strike data in the surrounding area. The two arrows, the first arrow, which is the orange arrow, points to the general location of the smoke that Mr. Bernardo observed in the photos that were shown to Your Honour earlier today. And the green arrow points to the approximate location of Mr. Bernardo when he took those photographs. It was Mr. Woods' opinion that it is highly likely that a lightning strike caused the initial fire, which is now known to be the Bennods Road fire, which continued to burn or smoulder underground in peat beds and then likely re-emerged to the surface on 8th of November 2019 when it continued to burn above ground and became known as the Mile Creek Road Borer Ridge fire. In terms of the cause and origin of the fire, Your Honour, it is submitted that the general area of origin of the Mile Creek Road fire was in an area proximate to a private property at 780 Mile Creek Road, Borer Ridge. The cause of the fire was smouldering peat, which escaped on 8th November 2019 due to strong wind and unfavourable fire weather conditions. The cause of that smouldering peat was a lightning strike that occurred on or about the 17th of October 2019. Those assisting the court, Your Honour, express their sincere thanks to those who have aided and provided information to the court throughout the Coronial inquiry into the Mile Creek Road fire.
Thank you, Mr. Harker.
Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Castleton.
Thank you, Your Honour. I propose to address Your Honour firstly on the Gospers Mountain fire, followed next by the Hillville fire, Hillville. Your Honour, the Gospers Mountain fire, Wallamai National Park, originated in remote bushland in the Wallamai National Park in October of 2019. This inquiry has been conducted pursuant to Section 30, subsection 1 of the Coroners Act, and is accordingly limited to determining the cause of the fire and the area of its origin. if able to be established to the satisfaction of the court. Your Honour, over a period of 15 weeks, the fire burnt an area of approximately 512,626 hectares, including the lands of the Darug, Gunungara, Awabakar, Darkinjung and Wanarua people. Fortunately, there was no loss of human life. Evidence adduced during the inquiry suggests the most likely cause of the Gospers Mountain fire was a lightning strike to a tree, or perhaps multiple trees, at about 10:55 a.m. on 26 October 2019 on a small remote knoll in the Wallamai National Park, about 2 to 3 kilometres southwest of Gospers Mountain, at the location of RFS grid reference 558382. This fire was one of very many fires, as Your Honour knows, across the state of New South Wales in that dreadful 2019-2020 bushfire season. Not all fires were reported to the coroner. Not all fires reported to the coroner proceeded to a coronial inquiry into cause and origin. Not all fires that proceeded to a coronial inquiry into the cause and origin will, as Your Honour know, continue to further consideration via a general inquiry as part of Your Honour's Stage 2 proceedings. The Gospers Mountain fire precipitated a further fire in the Gross Valley, which later became known as the Gross Valley Fire, Mount Wilson. As foreshadowed in the joint opening submissions for the Gospers Mountain and Gross Valley fires, some issues concerning the Gross Valley fire will be explored as part of Your Honour's Stage 2 representative case study hearings. I'd like to have played now, Your Honour, a video courtesy of the ABC which provides a snapshot of the ferocity of those two fires. Despite the sheer extent of the Gospers Mountain fire and the destruction caused, it is submitted that it is not necessary for the fire to proceed to further investigation via a general inquiry. Coming, if I may, now to the chronology of events. The likely area of origin of the Gospers Mountain fire was a small knoll about 2 to 3 kilometres southwest of Gospers Mountain. At 11 a.m, on 26 October 2019, a rain event passed over the knoll. Raw data obtained from the Australian Global Positioning and Tracking System, or GPATS, network via MetroWeather, shows a potential lightning strike at 10:55 a.m. in the vicinity of the suspected area of origin. At the time, the wind speed at the closest weather station was 14.8 kilometres per hour, wind direction 300 degrees being from the northwest, and wind gusts of up to 31.3 kilometres per hour. At 12:54 p.m. that day, a National Parks and Wildlife Service Rapid Aerial Response Team, or RART, in a helicopter near Turon, saw smoke in the vicinity of Gospers Mountain. They arrived at the site of the bushfire at 1:07 p.m. At that time, the fire was in its infancy. Crew member Andrew Benson, recorded that he saw an active 1 to 2 metre flame which was burning in thick bushland, and that by the time the helicopter completed its first overhead circle of the fire had increased in size from about 1.5 football fields to 2 football fields. The fire was being blown by westerly and northwesterly winds to the east and southeast. Crew member Dalet Hazel captured the helicopter's coordinates at the edge of the fire. Those coordinates were latitude 33 degrees, 3 minutes 27 seconds south, and longitude 150 degrees, 23 minutes 2 seconds east, with grid reference 557393. Your Honour, another crew member, Callum Wolfe, took 3 photographs of the fire at this early stage, which will be displayed now. On the following day, 27 October 2019, 6 National Parks and Wildlife Service officers were winched to the ground near the fire. Amongst them was Mr Benson. Mr Benson gave evidence that in the afternoon of that day he saw a stringy bark that had been hit by lightning. It was about 2 stories high. The top had been hit, which I believe was by lightning, so the tree had been split and a limb was laying down to the south. The foliage at the top of the tree was not intact, but was intact on the limb on the ground. In the limited time available to Mr Benson to make any observations, he stated he saw burn patterns in the form of narrow tracks that fed away from the tree to other ground that had been completely burnt. Mr Benson estimated that the tree was located about 100 metres northwest of where he entered the fireground. He entered the fireground at the team's anchor point, latitude 33 degrees, 4 minutes 5 seconds south, and longitude 150 degrees, 23 minutes 6 seconds east. A further National Parks and Wildlife Service officer, Lenny Smile-Smith, who did not give evidence, informed the police that earlier on that day he saw a stringy bark tree with its top section blown out and stringy bark spread around its base. He told police that the tree was northwest of the team's anchor point. The Gospers Mountain fire proceeded to spread primarily to the east and southeast over the following 15 weeks and combined with numerous other fires. It was declared out on 10 February 2020. Despite the best efforts of the National Parks and Wildlife Service and subsequently the Rural Fire Service, it ultimately grew to become the single largest bushfire in Australian recorded history. And Your Honour will see now the final progression map for the Gospers Mountain fire. The damage caused by the fire was surveyed by New South Wales Police. Over 147 properties were impacted, with homes and other structures destroyed in Clarence, Dargan, Lithgow, Bell, Newnes, Walgan Valley and Colo Heights. Your Honour has received into evidence around 2,000 pages of evidence, which includes statements from members of New South Wales Police, the National Parks and Wildlife Service and the Rural Fire Service, fire investigation reports and statements, Rural Fire Service documents, lightning strike data and Bureau of Meteorology weather data, including several witness statements from those who assisted with efforts to fight the fire in its early stages. Detective Sergeant Joshua Holgate, the police officer in charge of the cause and origin investigation, and Mr Peter Jones, fire investigator with the New South Wales RFS, who carried out the initial investigation of the fire, each gave evidence on the 15th of June this year. Additionally, Andrew Benson, Acting Field Supervisor, National Parks and Wildlife Service, and Rebecca Lowe, Meteorologist and Account Manager formerly at Metro Weather, respectively gave evidence on the 16th and 17th of June this year. Pursuant to Section 81 of the Coroners Act, the coroner, holding an inquiry concerning a fire, is required to make findings as to the date and place of the fire and the circumstances of the fire. In addition, the coroner may make recommendations considered necessary or desirable in relation to any matter connected with the fire inquiry. In this inquiry, the focus was on identifying where and when the Gospers Mountain fire originated and the circumstances of same, including, of course, its cause. Coming now, if I may, Your Honour, to the evidence of trees affected by lightning. The experts all agree that at least one tree on the knoll was hit by lightning and that this ignited the Gospers Mountain fire. They differ as to what tree was hit. Mr. Peter Jones identified a single tree as the likely point of origin, tree 1, during his ground inspection on 22 January 2020. And Your Honour will see now a photograph of tree 1. Detective Sergeant Peter Buning, who was not available to give oral evidence, identified a second tree as the point of origin, about 16 to 25 metres west of tree 1, known as tree 2, during his ground inspection on 15 June 2020. Mr. Jones was in attendance at that time. Your Honour will see a series of 3 photographs now of tree 2. Adjunct Associate Professor Trevor Blackburn, who did not give oral evidence or attend the site, but inspected samples from both trees on instructions from New South Wales Police, concluded that the main lightning strike hit tree 2 with a side flash to tree 1. That evidence does not align with the observations of Mr. Benson the day after ignition. Mr. Benson was shown photographs of tree 1 and 2, as well as another tree on the fire ground that was photographed by Mr. Jones, tree 3. Tree 3 was about 150 metres to the southeast, and Your Honour will see now 2 photographs of tree 3 taken by Mr. Jones. Mr. Benson's evidence was that the tree he saw definitely did not resemble tree 1, which in his view was not a stringy bark. Was a little bit smaller than tree 2, and the top was not as high standing, and more closely resembled tree 3. Irrespective of these discrepancies, all the evidence points to a lightning strike to one of 3 trees with a radius of about 150 metres. Mr. Jones was the first expert investigator to attend the knoll after ignition. On the 22nd of January 2020, he travelled by air to the general area that was first identified by National Parks and Wildlife Service officers on the 26th of October 2019 as having been affected by fire. Mr. Jones walked across the area in a serpentine motion, following the fire path indicators, including foliage freeze, angle of char and silt deposits, to an area where there was the least damage. All those indicators, in his opinion, pointed to the fire having ignited towards a higher point on the knoll, and specifically the base of tree 1. Mr. Jones identified a split in tree 1 that was consistent with that tree being hit by lightning. At the base of the crack was low scorching, consistent with a point of ignition. The tree was located within RFS grid reference 558382. Mr. Jones also located tree 3 during that investigation. The fire indicators that Mr. Jones followed did not originate from tree 3. Mr. Jones did not identify tree 2 during his initial investigation. That tree was first identified as potentially having been struck by lightning by Detective Sergeant Buning on 15 June 2020. By that time, most fire path indicators were no longer present. Detective Sergeant Buning carried out a survey of the area surrounding trees 1 and 2 within a 50-metre radius. The damage to tree 2 was in stark contrast to that to the surrounding trees. In his opinion, all other trees were not deeply charred and their upper branches and foliage were intact. Mr. Buning concluded that tree 2 was the only tree in the area that sustained major fire damage and indicated a significant lightning strike. He surmised that tree 2 was struck by lightning which ignited a fire that consumed the tree in the upper sections, which fell to the ground and continued to burn ground cover. He did not rule out the possibility that tree 1 was also struck, but there was no evidence at the time of his inspection in the upper tree or immediate surrounds that tree 1 was the area of origin. Mr. Jones stressed that he did not just go to the obvious trees showing damage, but followed the fire indicators. He disagrees that tree 2 was the source of ignition, as the coloration of the trunk of the tree indicated that it had died some time earlier, and there were no fire indicators suggesting that the fire spread from that tree in June of 2020. Mr. Jones did not conduct a ground-based examination for fire indicators around tree 2 during his first investigation. Both tree 1 and tree 2 were cut down for forensic analysis. That analysis was carried out by Adjunct Associate Professor Blackburn. Professor Blackburn found delamination and cracking in the samples of tree 1 and tree 2. Those features are the main indicators of a tree having been struck by lightning. The current vaporises the moisture within the tree, causing cracking and the peeling of some of the outer bark or wood. On that basis, and having regard to the photographs of the damage caused to both trees, Associate Professor Blackburn's opinion was that both trees were struck by lightning, with the main flash striking the tree with the more significant damage, namely tree 2. Coming to key conclusions. The discrepancies in the evidence are not easy to reconcile, Your Honour. The fire indicators identified by Mr. Jones, along with the testing by Adjunct Associate Professor Blackburn, show that tree 1 was most likely struck by lightning and ignited. However, tree 1 did not correspond with the description of the tree identified by National Parks and Wildlife Service officers the day after ignition, nor did it display the major lightning damage of tree 2. The court does not have the benefit of an expert investigation of fire path indicators proximate to tree 2. These had disappeared by the time that the tree was identified in June 2020. In those circumstances, the opinions of Associate Professor Blackburn and Detective Sergeant Buning cannot be discounted. Whilst it can be concluded, based on the evidence that tree 1 was hit by lightning and was a point of origin of the fire may also have ignited by a lightning strike to 1 or 2 other trees within a radius of 150 metres. Coming to the lightning strike data. Lightning strike data does not assist in resolving the discrepancy between the evidence and identifying a specific point of origin of the Gospers Mountain fire. Raw data obtained from MetroWeather shows a likely lightning strike at 10:55 a.m. on 26 October 2019 in the vicinity of the knoll. Although this strike was originally discounted by MetroWeather, the evidence indicates that not only was it an actual lightning strike, but it could possibly have been the strike that affected either tree 1 or tree 2. The strike was initially disregarded by GPATs due to conflicting recordings from network sensors. Weather data shows the potential strike occurring at the leading edge of a rain event that crossed over the knoll at about 11 a.m. on 26 October 2019. Rebecca Lowe gave evidence that it was her opinion, given the presence of the rain event, there was a high likelihood that the recording was of a lightning strike. No other strikes were identified in the immediate proximity of Tree 1 or Tree 2 in October of 2019. The strike was recorded as about 1 kilometre northeast of Tree 1. This map, Your Honour, prepared by New South Wales Police, shows the recorded location of the strike relative to Tree 1. That is point number 1. And Mr Benson's point of entry into the fireground is identified by point number 4. The recorded location of the strike was not identified by any of the experts as the source of the fire. It does not correspond with the fire indicators recorded by Mr Jones, nor images of the early movement of the fire which indicate that the fire was blown by westerly and northwesterly winds to the east and southeast. Ms Lowe's evidence was that the location accuracy of the GPAT's data depends in part on the number of sensors in the surrounding area, as well as the number that were online at the time. In the Gospers Mountain region, there would usually have been an expected accuracy of 200 to 250 metres. However, at the time of ignition, 2 sensors were down. Ms Lowe's opinion was that, because of this, it was quite possible that the strike occurred closer to the trees identified by the expert investigators, and that the location accuracy of the network on that day in the vicinity of Gospers Mountain was up to 1 kilometre. This appears to be likely given the evidence on the ground and of the movement of the fire in its early stages. Could there have been a cause other than lightning? On the evidence set out and the surrounding circumstances, it is our submission the most likely cause of the fire was a lightning strike. The area first identified by the National Parks and Wildlife Service as having been affected by the fire is remote, as Your Honour will see from this satellite image. It is situated in dense vegetation in the Wallamai National Park. There are no established bushwalking tracks leading to the suspected area of origin. The closest areas of human activity are a decommissioned airstrip some 1.7 kilometres to the west, a former army road, and some small structures 2 to 3 kilometres to the northeast of Gospers Mountain itself. The closest town is Glen Davis, over 11 kilometres to the west. According to National Parks and Wildlife Service officers, it is not an area commonly traversed by bushwalkers. Mr Jones could not find any evidence of human activity in the suspected area of origin, nor were any signs of human activity reported by the National Parks and Wildlife Service officers who responded to the fire on 26 and 27 October 2019. No natural substance has been identified by anyone that would be capable of spontaneous combustion. Your Honour, it is submitted that the origin of the Gospers Mountain fire was Tree 1 and perhaps another tree on a small remote knoll in Wallamai National Park, about 2 to 3 kilometres southwest of Gospers Mountain, at the location of Rural Fire Service Grid Reference 558382. We submit, Your Honour, the cause of the fire was lightning. Your Honour, those assisting, Your Honour, express their sincere gratitude to those who have aided and provided information to the court to assist with the coronial inquiry into the Gospers Mountain fire.
Thank you, Mr Castleton.
May it please Your Honour. Turning, if I may, Your Honour, to the Hillville fire. Hillville, this fire, Your Honour, burned for approximately 7 weeks within the Mid-Coast local government area encompassed within the lands of the Worimi people. This inquiry has been conducted pursuant to Section 30, subsection 1 of the Coroners Act, and is accordingly limited to determining the cause of the fire and the area of its origin, if able to be established to the satisfaction of the court. The fire ultimately burnt an area of approximately 310,000 hectares, including large portions of hardwood forest within the Kiwak State Forest, Tullawal State Conservation Area and Capping Hut National Park and beyond. No loss of human life ensued. There is no doubt, Your Honour, from the evidence adduced during the inquiry that the fire originated in the village of Hillville on a private landholding, namely 120 Marylands Close. Displayed now, for Your Honour's benefit, is a Google Earth satellite image. The red marker identifies 120 Marylands Close, Hillville. As Your Honour can see from the image, the property lies at the end of a stretch of road. The Kiwak State Forest is situated to the west. Despite the evidence that the property was the general point of origin, it will ultimately be submitted that there is insufficient evidence to identify, to the requisite standard, the precise cause of the fire or the precise point of origin of the fire. This fire, like so many others, burnt across the state of New South Wales in 2019-2020 bushfire season. Not all fires were reported to Your Honour. Not all fires reported to Your Honour proceeded to a coronial inquiry into cause and origin. And not all fires that proceeded to a coronial inquiry into the cause and origin will continue to further consideration via a general inquiry as part of Stage 2 of Your Honour's proceedings. It is submitted that it is not necessary for the Hillville fire to proceed to further investigation via a general inquiry. Coming now to the chronology of events. This fire, Your Honour, is believed to have commenced on or before the 7th of November 2019 in a partially cleared small paddock south of the farmhouse situated on the subject property. At the time of the fire, the subject property was occupied by the late Mr. Geoffrey Kinchin and his wife, Mrs. Peggy Kinchin. Police undertook a separate electronically recorded interview with each of Mr. and Mrs. Kinchin on 15 November 2019 and a further one on 9 September 2020. Mrs. Kinchin additionally gave oral evidence during the inquiry. Those assisting the court understand that Mr. Kinchin passed away in late 2021, and we express our sincere condolences to the family and friends of Mr. Kinchin. Mr. and Mrs. Kinchin each stated in their records of interviews that at around 1:30 p.m. on 7 November 2019, they observed their chicken pen, situated southwest of the farmhouse, alight. At 1:38 p.m, Mrs. Kinchin rang 000 and reported to Fire and Rescue in New South Wales that their chicken pen was alight and there was a grass fire travelling uphill. She further advised that the fire was some 20 to 30 metres from the farmhouse. Ron will see shortly a video that was taken by their neighbour, Andrew Nelson, of the chicken pen. Following this, Mr. and Mrs. Kinchin rang surrounding neighbours to request assistance. Despite the best efforts of Mr. and Mrs. Kinchin and their neighbours, some half an hour later, on account of the predominantly west-northwest wind, the fire escaped and spread east onto the adjoining property, 99 Marylands Close. Noting that the subject property was no longer under threat, New South Wales Rural Fire Service resources were targeted at fighting the fire on 99 Marylands Close to protect that property and adjacent properties. At around 2:05 p.m, Superintendent Jason Regan took several aerial photographs of the fire in its infancy in Fire Spotter 265, with the fire appearing to be to the east and south of the farmhouse. According to Mr. Kitchen, sometime that afternoon he noticed that the edge of a pile of logs located to the east and south of the farmhouse on the property was smouldering, and he moved the top logs off and sprayed the logs until the embers had disappeared. Mr. and Mrs. Kitchen each state that this pile of logs had been stacked crisscross about 1/2 metre high and had been left there for possible use as future firewood. At around 6 p.m, the fire was mapped as having spread some 5 kilometres east-south-east past the Tullawal Nature Reserve, and by 8 p.m. as having reached Breakneck Hill. I have played now a video prepared by Detective Senior Constable Tony Cremeri, which includes mapping and an overlay of a line scan to demonstrate the vast extent of the fire spread by 8 p.m. on the 7th of November 2019. It had by that time spread about 5 kilometres in 5 hours. At around 9 a.m. on the following day, that is the 8th of November 2019, Mr. Barry Smith, a neighbour of Mr. and Mrs. Kitchen, who prepared a statement, stated he attended the subject property with his tractor to see if they required use of his tractor. Mr. Smith stated he observed a log that was smouldering on the eastern side of the house at a location between the farmhouse and the carport with a caravan, believed to be situated some 50 to 100 metres uphill from the pile to the far south and east of the farmhouse, and close to an unburnt area of grass. With the approval of Mr. Kitchen, Mr. Smith advised that he scooped some earth from the unburnt area over the smouldering log. Mr. Kitchen stated that on the morning of 8 November 2019, Mrs. Kitchen got up to make coffee and looked at the pile situated to the east and south of the farmhouse and saw that what was left of it was in flame. He stated that he and his wife worked on stamping out the fire because they were concerned about the unburnt grass in the vicinity catching alight. Further, when Mr. Smith arrived at their farmhouse later that morning with his tractor, he stated that Mr. Smith pushed some earth over the logs. Later that day, the fire impacted on properties at Rainbow Flat. Your Honour will shortly see a video of the fire taken from the helicopter Fire Spotter 265 in the afternoon of 8 November. With Your Honour's leave, I'd like to play two further videos taken by an officer from the Fire and Rescue New South Wales, which provides some insight into the conditions on the ground on the 8th of November 2019.
Yeah, just watching this fire pop out again. So we've got flame height of about 1 to 1.5 metres. This fire is heading directly towards this property. So the property is surrounded by a large dry grassed area. So there are no firefighting resources in this area at all. This is the flank of the head. So it's running towards Old Bar Road. There you can see it's running through the Melaleuca forest here. Running through the Melaleuca forest, backing towards Wallaby Point. So that open space of vegetation there is the vegetation run that will go to the back of the service station. The fire rescue crews there moving barbecue gas cylinders and other portable flammable material into an open space which will be covered with salvage sheets and then protected with water.
The next day, Your Honour, the 9th of November 2019, the fire impacted on properties in the areas of Old Bar and Wallaby Point. And Your Honour will see shortly the fire progression map, which shows the reach of the Hillville fire by the 9th of November 2019. Some 3 days later, that is the 12th of November 2019, the fire impacted on the areas of Tinanee, Purfleet and Old Bar, and a south-southeasterly change was pushing the fire in a north-westerly direction towards Nabiac and Falford and in the vicinity of the Falford Road Darrawank fire. At 11:06 p.m. on the 13th of November 2019, the Falford Road Darrawank fire was amalgamated with the Hillville fire by the RFS Incident Management Team, and from there on, the Falford Road Darrawank fire commenced being mapped and managed as part of the Hillville fire. On this same day, the Hillville fire was downgraded to watch and act. The Hillville fire was eventually recorded as out on Boxing Day 2019. The damage caused by the fire was surveyed by New South Wales Police. At least 156 structures were destroyed or damaged in connection with this fire, including at least 61 homes in Hillville, Coronal, Old Bar, Rainbow Flat and Tinanee. Coming to the evidence, Your Honour. Your Honour has received into evidence 2 volumes of material which include statements from members of New South Wales Police and RFS, fire investigation reports and statements, RFS documents, lightning strike data and Bureau of Meteorology weather data, police transcripts of records of interview with each of Mr and Mrs Kitchen, and several witness statements from those who assisted with efforts to fight the fire in its early stages. Detectives Sergeant Guymer, Mr Fulliger and Mrs Kitchen gave oral evidence on the 24th of March this year. Pursuant to Section 81 of the Coroners Act, the coroner holding an inquiry concerning a fire is required to make findings as to the date and place of the fire and the circumstances of that fire. In addition, the coroner may make recommendations considered necessary or desirable in relation to any matter connected with the fire inquiry. In this inquiry, the focus was on identifying where and when the Hillville fire originated and the circumstances of same, including the cause. Now to the cause and origin investigation. The suspected general area of origin was not secured or guarded by New South Wales Police between 7 and 14 November 2019, a period of 1 week. On 9 November 2019, the RFS assigned fire investigator Mark Fulliger to investigate the cause and origin of the Hillville fire and other fires in the mid-coast New South Wales RFS district between 10 and 15 November 2019. New South Wales Police assigned Detective Sergeant Shane Guymere, attached to the Forensic and Technical Services Command, or FETS, Taree crime scene section to examine the cause and origin of the Hillville fire. Mr Fulliger stated that on the afternoon of 10 November 2019, he contacted the former police officer in charge of the investigation into the Hillville fire, namely Detective Sergeant David Frith, and they agreed to conduct an initial scene inspection of this fire later that day, with the intention of returning to the scene at a later date to complete the investigation. Mr Fulliger stated this necessitated him to travel approximately a two-hour distance from the Wauchope Fire Control Centre, by which time he would be close to 12 hours on shift by that late afternoon. Mr Fulliger stated that he arrived at 99 Marylands Close at 3:05 p.m. with Detective Sergeant Frith, Detective Senior Constable Aaron Toll and Senior Constable Warwick Holborough, Crime Scene Officer attached to FETS, Taree Crime Scene Section. Mr Fulliger recorded that while at 99 Marylands Close, he walked beside the boundary fence shared with the subject property and made his way to where the fire had crossed from the subject property to 99 Marylands Close. Mr Fulliger observed fire indicators of foliage freeze, grass stem fall, angle of char indicating the fire had travelled from the west uphill and onto 99 Marylands Close. He was able to identify a number of runs of fire that initiated on the subject property. Mr Fulliger stated he and Detective Sergeant Frith, Detective Senior Constable Tull and Senior Constable Holborough relocated to the subject property at 4 p.m. During his oral evidence, Mr Fulliger accepted that in line with his report, he was present at 4 p.m. when Mr Kitchen advised police that when he first sighted the fire, he observed that Chook Shed was alight. Mr Fulliger advised that on that day he did not necessarily look for particular indicators or microfire indicators consistent with Mr Kitchen's account in relation to the origin of the fire, because at that time he had been examining where the fire had been running and indicators he had seen. Mr Fulliger recorded the following with respect to his examination undertaken on the subject property. We exited the house yard through a gate into a predominantly grass paddock with an uphill slope to the east and groupings of trees. The grass appeared to be partially maintained within 20 metres of the gate, as it was short and 90% cured. The grass outside of this 20-metre area was not maintained and varied in height from 30 centimetres to half a metre. Approximately 5 metres from the gate at grid reference 401599, within the maintained grassed area, there was evidence of machinery use. I observed a pushed-up pile of dirt and logs or vegetation showing signs of having recently been burnt, as heat and smoke was emanating from it. This was the only spot where a machine had been used along a burnt edge. The southern side of the pushed-up pile was circular, with charcoal, ash, rock debris and burnt logs, along with a small oxidised piece of corrugated iron. The intensity at this location of the initial fire was high, as there had been complete combustion down to mineral earth. The indicators show a low-intensity fire moving away from this circular pattern sometime later. Your Honour will now see a photograph taken by Mr Fulliger of the pushed-up pile to which I've just referred. Mr Fulliger went on to record, and I quote, "I walked the perimeter of the north-northeastern, western and southern western edge of the fire for approximately 50 metres in a clockwise and counterclockwise direction. During this walk, I observed indicators of grass, stem, angle of char protection, sooting and staining showed a low-intensity fire moving away from the pile in a south-southeasterly direction. Due to the slope gaining intensity and crossed into the neighbouring property at 99 Marylands Close under the predominantly west-norwesterly wind. It was at this time a decision was made to conclude the investigation due to time constraints on both police and fire investigator and return to the property at a later time to complete the origin and cause investigation. Detective Senior Constable Tull took a short video evidencing the smoke emanating from the pile.
I'm not surprised. In fact, when he did that, I said it's probably still in a small one. Is there a big stump or something? No. Well, there was two hardwood runners on the bottom.
4:30 p.m. 10th of November 2019.
And
Mr Fulliger stated that he departed the subject property at around 5 p.m. and that he understood that the police officers in attendance had other matters to attend to later in the afternoon and early evening. Mr Kitchen stated that shortly after RFS and police had left his residence on the 10th of November 2019, and having been made aware by them that the pile was still smouldering, he took his tractor and spread out the pile even further. Mr Fulliger confirmed during his oral evidence that he had conducted a detailed examination of the area in and around where the chicken pen existed and had observed indicators of advancing fire travelling to the chicken pen. He rejected the notion that those indicators may have in fact been lateral or flanking fire and did not think that if the fire originated from the chicken pen, it would have moved across the prevailing wind in that direction towards the pile of debris. While he did not necessarily look for glass around the chicken pen, he stated he did not observe any glass. He also accepted that spontaneous combustion or heating can occur in poultry manure, but had excluded this as a likely cause due to the indicators observed that the fire went into the chicken pen. Mr Fulliger additionally advised that he did not, as part of his examination, undertake a search of any glass objects that could have been a source of ignition in and around the log pile, nor did he disturb the log pile on 10 November 2019. While he stated he did not observe any glass objects there at the time, he accepted that a glass bottle or some glass in an existing log pile or vegetation, depending on its shape and location, can cause an ignition. Detective Senior Constable Tull stated that he could not recall why the investigation of police was not concluded on 10 November 2019, and further that he had accompanied Detective Sergeant Frith for the purpose of providing assistance, including adducing evidence by way of taking photographs and a video as was required. Mr Fulliger detailed that he could not recall when he agreed to attend the subject property with police for a second time. However, he recalled that Detective Sergeant Guy Meir was available on 14 November 2019, which is why it was agreed they would return to the scene at that time. Further, given the Memorandum of Understanding between New South Wales RFS, Fire and Rescue New South Wales and New South Wales Police regarding responsibility for fire investigation, he stated it was appropriate that police be present for the second scene examination. Mr. Fulliger expressed that it is not uncommon to attend the scene of a fire more than once when conducting fire investigations. Between Mr. Fulliger leaving the subject property on 10 November 2019 and returning some 4 days later at 10:55 a.m. on 14 November 2019 to examine the scene with Detective Sergeant Guy Meir and Detective Senior Constable Toll in attendance, Mr. Fulliger recorded the following observations, and I quote, "On inspection, the fire scene had been dramatically altered, with the pile of dirt and logs having been spread out over the burnt ground by use of machinery and other material. Unburnt logs, branches and polypipe introduced to the fire scene. This was the only spot a machine had been used on the burnt edge of the fire on the property. Having previously walked the immediate perimeter, I entered the fire scene from the northeastern edge of the fire and I observed an advancing run of fire uphill to the east. I continued walking in a southwesterly direction until I found the middle of an advancing run of fire in a grove of standing trees. Using a serpentine pattern, I followed the advancing indicators, area of most damage in a northerly direction and tracked the run of the fire back to the area where the initial pile of logs or vegetation and dirt was observed, the area of least damage. I then entered the fire ground from the southwestern edge, near where a small shed had been destroyed, and I tracked the advancing indicators back to the area where the initial pile of logs and dirt was observed. The indicators revealed that the fire had travelled into the shed from the north as a low-intensity fire. I observed indicators of foliage freeze and leaf curl on leaves, angle of char on tree trunks, fence posts and grass tufts, protection, white ash on the trunks of trees, sooting on metal fence posts and wire fence strings. There were also 2 circular areas near the fence, bare of grass that appeared to have previously had fires. Under the prevailing weather conditions on the day, the dryness of the surrounding fuel, the fire that has crept out of the pile was of low intensity and may well have been burning for some time before the owner observed the shed alight and called 000. Mr. Fulliger recorded that he had eliminated potential causes including lightning, campfire, smoking, equipment use, juvenile fire play, rail and miscellaneous such as fireworks or flares, and ultimately expressed the opinion with respect to his investigation undertaken on 10 and 14 November that the fire was caused by debris burning from embers or burnt material escaping the pile burn lit by a person or persons unknown and conducted on or prior to the 7th of November 2019. He noted, Your Honour, that on 10 November 2019 he was able to examine the scene, identify fire indicators, identify the area of origin and take photographic evidence. Although the scene had been altered by the time he returned on the 14th of November, he surmised there were still indicators present. As such, he stated that the alteration of the scene between 10 and 14 November did not impact his conclusion on cause and origin. Notwithstanding this, during his oral evidence, Mr. Fulliger accepted that the scene had been disturbed at least twice by the interaction with machinery, and that to the extent there may have been in existence a glass object in or around the pile, it may not have been discovered by reason of the disturbances. Further, he accepted that spontaneous heating or combustion could occur in relation to a pile of vegetation or logs that could have been present in situ for some time, depending on the specific type of vegetation and depending on the conditions. However, as to the pile of logs or vegetation in question, he stated he would not have had enough information to include or exclude spontaneous heating or combustion as a possible cause. Detective Sergeant Guy Mears stated during his oral evidence that prior to his examination, he was aware that Mr and Mrs Kitchen had advised police that they believed the fire had started in or around the chicken pen, and recorded that, and I quote, 7 days had passed since the start of the fire. The scene had been secured. I think they should read, the scene had not been secured or guarded. People had conducted numerous activities at the location, altering the scene over those 7 days. Objects and items were located on the fireground to the east of the farmhouse, consisting of pieces of wood, timber and sticks, as well as lengths of black poly pipe. These objects had been placed on the fireground after the fire. Tyre marks and use of an earth-moving blade were visible on the ground. These tyre marks and use of the earth-moving blade were also after the fire. Detective Sergeant Guy Mears opined with respect to his investigation, undertaken on 14 November 2019, there is no doubt that the fire started to the east and south of the farmhouse, as proven by the photographs taken by Superintendent Regan on 7 November 2019. While he agreed with Mr Fulliger as to the suspected general area of origin, he was unable to identify the specific area of origin and the specific cause of the fire on account of the altered fire scene. Accordingly, he concluded that the cause and specific origin of the fire was undetermined. During his oral evidence, Detective Sergeant Guy Mears further clarified that on his view there were too few fire indicators which were also somewhat contradictory. Additionally, he saw, and I quote, nothing in the immediate surrounds of the chicken pen to be able to make any determination as to direction of approach or a fire leaving that building, end quote. And he had found a suggestion he believed, which had been put to him by Mr and Mrs Kitchen, being that the fire could have ignited by way of spontaneous combustion of decaying chook manure, to be unlikely. Furthermore, Detective Sergeant Guy Mears surmised that it was certainly possible but unlikely that the fire ignited within the pile of debris caused by the reflection or refraction of a piece of glass. He stated that he conducted an examination in the vicinity of the chicken pen and stated he did not recall seeing any disused pieces of glass. However, he may well have missed a portion of glass. While he conceded that the prevailing wind on the day would have made it difficult for the fire to have started in the chicken pen, fire can still burn back towards the wind depending on the fuel available. Mr and Mrs Kitchen stated consistently to police they did not light a fire in the pile of logs on or before 7 November 2019, and to their knowledge neither did any other person. On their recall, at around 1:30 p.m. on 7 November 2019, they each stated that they observed the chicken pen alight and that sometime later that day the fire spread to the pile of logs. Mrs Kitchen's resolve on this matter remained unchanged during her oral evidence. Coming to key conclusions. Your Honour, it is submitted that there is insufficient evidence to identify the precise cause of the fire or the precise point of origin of the fire. While it is accepted that the fire may have been caused by debris burning from embers or burnt material escaping the pile burn, lit by a person or persons unknown, it is contended that a finding cannot be made on the balance of probabilities that this is the likely cause of the fire. Competing and equally likely causes of the fire exist, and to choose between them, in our respectful submission, would result in impermissible speculation or conjecture. The evidence suggests that prior to Mr Fuller's examination of the scene on 10 November 2019, the scene had been disturbed on at least 3 separate occasions, with 2 such disturbances occasioned by machinery use. The evidence also suggests, Your Honour, that the scene was again disturbed on 10 November 2019 after Mr Fuller and attending police had left the scene and prior to the attendance of Mr Fuller and Detective Sergeant Guy Meir on 15 November 2019. Although some theoretically possible causes such as lightning, campfire, smoking, equipment use, juvenile fire play, rail and miscellaneous such as fireworks or flares can be eliminated from consideration, there remains, in our submission, insufficient circumstantial evidence to find that one possible cause of the fire is more likely than another competing possible cause of the fire. It is possible that a piece of glass, unobserved, in or around the chicken pen caused ignition of the fire by way of reflection or refraction, or the fire was caused by spontaneous heating or combustion of poultry manure in or around the chicken pen. However, on balance of probabilities, on balance, these possibilities perhaps are tempered somewhat on account of the prevailing winds at the time and the indicators observed by Mr Fuller of fire having advanced to the chicken pen. It is also possible that the fire was caused by the reflection or refraction of a piece of glass in or around the pile of debris, particularly unobserved more so due to the circumstances of at least 3 disturbances detailed earlier, and noting that the pile was not disturbed by either Mr Fuller or police to either rule in or exclude this possibility. There is also insufficient evidence to include or exclude the possibility that the fire was caused due to spontaneous heating or combustion of the debris pile. Your Honour, the fire originated in a partially cleared small paddock to the south of the farmhouse on the subject property. Where it exactly started remains unclear, although Mr Fuller believes it started in a pile of debris located to the east and south of the farmhouse, approximately 5 metres from the gate leading into the paddock at grid reference 401599. Contrary to the opinion evidence of Mr Fuller is the direct evidence of the first eyewitnesses of the fire, Mr and Mrs Kitchen, who have firmly stated that the fire started in or around the chicken pen. It is submitted that in practical terms the difference is largely insignificant. Coming now to our final submissions on cause and origin of the fire. Your Honour, it is respectfully submitted that the Hillville fire ignited on or before 7 November 2019 on private property, namely 120 Marylands Close, Hillville, in a partially cleared small paddock to the south of the farmhouse. The likely cause of the fire, or the likely specific or actual point of origin of the fire, is undetermined. In conclusion, Your Honour, can those assisting Your Honour express our sincere gratitude to those who have aided and provided information to assist Your Honour with Your Honour's inquiry into the Hillville fire. May it please the Court.
Thank you, Mr Castleton.
Your Honour, that concludes closing addresses this morning. The hearing schedule for tomorrow, Your Honour, is to enable closing address in relation to the Stockyard Flat Fire, Yarrowitch. My learned friend, Ms Ward of Senior Counsel, and Mr Wilcock will address Your Honour in relation to that fire and the related inquest into the death of Russell Bratby. And then, Your Honour, myself and Mr Harker will address Your Honour in relation to the Palmer's Oakie fire up at Turon.
Thanks very much, Mr Castleton. We'll adjourn and resume at 10 a.m. tomorrow.
Please, the court.
Silence, please, all stand. This coroner's court is now adjourned.